In stage plays, you tell the audience what the protagonist is thinking. In film and TV, you show the audience what the protagonist is thinking. But in games, you guide the protagonist so they can have thoughts themselves. I love sad films. I love Titanic. I wanted to see if we could do something similar in the game space, but also make it a little bit uplifting with a bit of that Pixar magic and whimsy. The player can really find these moments of vulnerability. They can immerse themselves in the game, and they're able to experience emotions like anger or sadness or excitement in a very safe, contained place.
Welcome to the podcast, Sam Cable.
Hello, hello.
You're the founder and head of narrative at Spoonful of Wonder. You're a writer, a game director. Your debut game, Copycat, won Best International Game at the SEA Game Awards, and your body of work has been named Young Creative of the Year at ADC in Europe. I'm just going to call it. You're super impressive.
Thank you. Very, very kind.
One of the things I'm really interested to talk to you about is crafting stories in a game. And I also really want to hear your thoughts on why gaming is so popular and where the future of interactive storytelling is headed, because it is such a growing area. Let's start at the beginning, though. How did you become a gamer? What's the first game you ever remember playing?
That's such a great question. I grew up in the early 90s and we always play games with my younger sister. So we'd take turns sitting in front of the TV or sitting on the computer. And whatever I couldn't do, she did. And whatever she couldn't do, I did until we finally got to the end. My very first game was Pokemon Blue. And we didn't have a Nintendo, but my uncle got us a floppy disk of a burnt version of it, and we played it on the computer. So it meant we could never finish the game, we could never trade, but it did mean that we had a really wonderful experience together. Most of the games I grew up playing were animal related with some light platforming, and that combined really well with the Pixar and Disney films that I was watching at the time. So that's kind of how I fell into gaming.
Do you remember as a kid what you loved about it?
Yeah, it was really wholesome. It had magical worlds. There was a component that was quite intimate as well. So you felt like you were with these characters riding along their journey. And so when they won, you won as well.
That's so lovely. It's tapping back into those memories of when you first fell in love with an art form. And now you're the founder and head of narrative at Spoonful of Wonder. Who exactly are Spoonful of Wonder and what do you do?
We're a very small studio. And I work with my team partner, Kostya Lyakov. We do everything and cover a lot of ground between us. Kostya looks after the code and the animation and art of the game, and I do story and everything else. He's my partner in life and in work, so we take this very seriously, and we've been working on our small little company for the last couple of years, working on making narrative-driven emotional animal games. That's kind of our specialty.
Yeah, I really want to hear more about creating that emotional connection in games because you do that so beautifully. But what inspired you to start the company?
Kostya and I have worked together for about 10 years in different formats. So we started with a kid's book, we did a short film animation, we played with a couple of live action animations as well, but we mainly found a lot of practice in storytelling through our day jobs, which was working in a creative team in an advertising agency. And so we would be in charge of creating these 60-second ads and trying to inject some whimsy and some magic in them. And once we had been in the industry for a couple of years, we were looking to take a bit of a break. We wanted a passion project that would really inspire us and keep us moving forward. And we decided, how hard could a game be? We had practiced doing 3-minute animations. We thought we'd make the jump to 3-hour games. Turns out it's a lot more complex. But our studio's positioning is to spark nostalgia and ignite imagination. And we focus on a bit of magic and metaphor in there too.
I love your ambition. I love that you just went, I'm going to give it a go.
And we were so grateful. Screen Australia gave us a bit of funding, and that was the step from turning our project from a passion project into a proper business.
So your first game, Copycat, it actually puts players in the paws of a cat. It's such a beautiful game, and it really does a great job of creating that emotional journey and connection. What drew you to that idea, and how do you create an emotional connection with a character when that character doesn't even speak?
Yes, it's a very good question. It's a narrative-driven adventure game about the meaning of home set in the Australian suburbs. And it follows the story of Dawn. She's a skeptical shelter cat who gets adopted into a family, and she thinks she's found her forever home. But things take a bit of a turn when a stray copycat steals her place in the home, and then she ends up on the streets. Copycat is about 3 hours long, and we focus on love, loneliness, and letting go. She is a non-verbal protagonist, so there was a couple of ways we went about making sure that her emotional journey fit in and we were able to get a really engaged player base. So the first thing we did was give her an internal monologue. We have like a David Attenborough-esque character that kind of talks her through like a little bit of the angel and devil technique in order to guide her between the different levels and ultimately get her from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. We had pop-up text in the game that kind of acted as her thoughts. So if she saw a photo in the house of a photograph in a frame, she might think something like, oh, I don't belong here, or I've never fit into families, why would this be any different? So that was a good way to explore her voice. And the third way we did it was through music. Our beautiful composer, Daniel Bunting, did a really good job. The writing was very closely tied with the music to make sure we had these highs and lows. It also meant that music acted almost as the punctuation mark in the scenes. And so we were able to generate a bit of catharsis that way.
It's so interesting because you're using the same technique that we use in television, really. You're giving the character a really clear desire and then emotional vulnerability that helps us as an audience emotionally orientate to that character. And what is the journey that you want to take players on in Copycat? What feeling are you trying to create?
Kostya and I were reflecting on this before the game started, and we wanted to try to figure out what the message was going to be. I grew up between a couple of different countries, and so my idea of home was very fleeting. We were always standing up and on the move. Whereas Kostya's background, he grew up in the same house for 20 years, but now he's no longer allowed to return back to it because his parents live in Ukraine and there's a war zone. And so we were kind of tinkering with that world, and we wanted to make players aware of just how important home is, and we were doing it through the lens of a cat who was going from home to home, trying to find her place in the world. So ultimately, we realized home wasn't about necessarily where your things are. Home wasn't about where you grew up. Instead, home is the place where you're needed most. And that was our driving thought for the story.
Beautiful. You've worked in screenwriting and game writing. What was the biggest adjustment when you moved into interactive storytelling?
It was a big adjustment, for sure. With traditional mediums, whether it's a stage play or a screenplay or a TV series, you can point the camera and all the information you can get within the shot. But with games, you think of it a bit like a compass. The player can really go anywhere and do anything to a certain extent. In stage plays, you tell the audience what the protagonist is thinking. In film and TV, you show the audience what the protagonist is thinking. But in games, you guide the protagonist so they can have thoughts themselves. It kind of boils down to player agency. It's about giving the player the feeling that their action has consequences and they are making a difference in the world. And one of the ways to do this is through branching narrative.
Can you describe to us what branching narrative is?
It's when a player is confronted with two different forks on the road and they have to decide which road they're going to travel down. This can be physically into a space where a player can choose what room to go into, or it could be more like conversational. You could choose which quest to take, you could choose what line of dialogue to respond to a question, and all these little elements are remembered by the game and have a bit of a payoff at the end.
So when you're developing a story structure for a game and you've got to develop all these different branches, what is that development process like?
It's very exciting. The first question you probably need to ask yourself is what type of game this is going to be. Are you taking a protagonist, a character that already has wants and needs, flaws, obsessions and secrets, and you are going to kind of go on their journey, or are you going to go on a journey that is you? You are the character. You typically name the character. You might customize how the character looks, the gender of the character, and of course, where you're going with the character. And I think those two are very different forms of storytelling. Both need a very rich story world.
And are they the only two choices you have in the gaming world, or are they the two main choices?
I think that's the two main choices, or especially for me starting in this world, that was something I focused on. In development, you also need to decide how long a game's going to be. For us, we made a very short 3-hour game, which in my case was very long. But in a lot of game world, a game that's shorter than 10 hours is considered very short, and big games can almost be up to 60 hours. So you can imagine the huge team behind that.
And do you actually plot in the same way you plot a screenplay, or how do you develop the narrative through line?
I still work within a traditional 3-act structure, and you kind of just extend those plot points out. It might be a bit more similar, though, to episodic if you're going on these big 60-hour quests. But in our case, we just did a traditional 3-act structure and made sure that we were hitting all the turning points. There was plenty of reversals in there. In my case, I work by myself, but if you had a really big game with a bigger team, I definitely think there'll be a room of writers in there working busily away. One other thing that's really interesting is that there's no guarantee the player will go in the way you expected. You are crafting story that has to serve a player who's going through and speed running everything and maybe not absorbing all the story versus a player that's going to take the time to learn, read all the pop-ups, go through. And so you're serving both characters.
What does your script document look like when you're writing a game? It must be a very complicated element. Or do you write like, here's a script for this journey, here's a script for this journey? What's actually on the page?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Julie. I love it. I think it's because it's the thing I've been grappling the most. We've finished Copycat and we're now starting the scripting journey for the second game. So a lot of the learnings I'm taking are going to be in this game too. You can write however you like. There's a little bit of leeway in games, and so it's more about getting the game into the machine, the game engine. Some people write in Final Draft and Word doc, but the limitation is when you have branching narrative and you have multiple journeys that a character can go through, it becomes a little bit hard because the formatting's quite rigid. Some people use more programmer-based softwares like Inky or Yarn Spinner. And that's great because it does the branching narrative, but the limitation is you can't print it out and give it to a writer friend who can give you feedback. There's also people that use a software called Twine, which is really good for branching narrative. It's text-based and it's accessible, but again, it's hard to weave dialogue into that. So there's not like one script for a writer. Most people have to then take whatever they've written in whatever format and then put it into an Excel document, which is not glamorous at all, but copying and pasting every line. We had 10,000 words. We had about 1,000 lines of dialogue and copying, pasting every single line into the Excel and then getting that document into the game.
In a game as long as Copycat, so 3 hours, how many story branches did you have?
We use nodal design, which means that we give the player a choice. It branches out and then it connects in the middle. And so that meant that we were able to tell quite a linear story. It was our very first game, so we didn't really know what we were doing. So in that case, we only really had one ending. For future games, I'm looking forward to having a bit more of a branching narrative, and you can have 5 or 6 endings, or you could have hundreds based off the choices that you make throughout the journey.
What makes a truly great game narrative in your experience? Are there common ingredients that really create that immersive and unforgettable story?
Yeah, there's some really wonderful games out there. Night in the Woods, Life is Strange. I'm playing a game called Detroit Becomes Human at the moment. I think something all these games have in common is this idea of catharsis. They create a space where the player can really find these moments of vulnerability. They can immerse themselves in the game, and the game gives them the space to process complex theories like grief or loss, and they're able to experience emotions like anger or sadness or excitement in a very safe, contained place. Those are the sort of games I'm looking for and really enjoy the stories. A good story works across all mediums, but a really great story leverages the medium that it works in.
Oh, I love that. A really great story leverages the medium. That's a fantastic way to put it. So the story elements are the same, but you've got to leverage into the strengths of what that medium can give you. That's beautiful. One of the interesting things about game storytelling, though, is you've got to have the story alongside the game mechanics. Can you tell us what game mechanics are and how you kind of bring story and game mechanics together?
Game mechanics are the rules and the systems that the player interacts with in the game. So think of them as the verbs. They are the jump, the shoot, the discover, the hide, the converse, the solve. And once you have the mechanics of the game in place, the story kind of weaves through. And so the mechanics need to serve the story and the story needs to serve the mechanics. It's helpful to work out what genre of game you're playing in. Is this a puzzle platformer, or is this a looter shooter, or is this a narrative-driven game? Some of the mechanics that we worked with in Copycat were very simple, and they were created to honor the sassy cat. So it could be things like knocking a cup off the table or meowing. Those are really simple game mechanics. We had scenes where the cats were in a fight with bigger, stronger feral cats. And so the player had to do some button mashing on their controller and press the right button in the right order to win that challenge. And so in the beginning of the game, we gave them a lot more simple button mashing scenarios versus at the end where it's a lot more complex. And because you've done the challenge a couple of times, you feel more in control and ultimately give that feeling of winning at the end. So that's just a small way that we looked at mechanics and narrative together.
So you're building the level of difficulty of the mechanics throughout the game to give a sense of player satisfaction that they've achieved something, they've got better. In the process of development, you said you decide on the mechanics quite early on. When you were creating Copycat, did you decide on the mechanics and then build the story, or those two things happen hand in hand?
We started story first just because we knew that was our strength. We had come from advertising, so ideation was really important to us, and we really enjoyed that creative part of the process because we were a narrative-driven game, or what the terminology in the game world, it's called a walking sim. You walk around and a story unfolds around you. If you are in a game studio that's a little bit more focused on combat or a little bit more focused on puzzles, it makes sense that the mechanics will definitely come first.
I often say in television that it's a team sport. There's a lot of people that are involved in making anything, film, television. It just has many touch points, depending on how big that is. I imagine it's similar with games. Who's the core team?
I think there's always someone that's going to handle the code and be head of programming. In the games I like to play, there's typically someone that looks after the narrative. In our case, we were a small two-person team. We onboarded our composer and we were able to kind of fill in the rest of the blanks, whether that was making sound effects or doing the marketing or looking after the business side of the business. Some teams are huge. A AA studio might have between 30 to 35 people, and a AAA studio, which is the top games, would have hundreds and hundreds of people on their team.
You really did this with really a team of 3. It's incredible. I love that. And it's really important to remember that we can scale these things, because I think about people coming into the industry, and if you think, oh, I couldn't possibly, because it has to be AAA, and I think the same with television, it has to be premium. But if you actually get in there, find a way to do it, you can start at the scale that you're able to and then work your way up. One of the most exciting things about gaming is that players shape the story. So how do you create a story that gives agency as well as creating that narrative satisfaction?
We wanted people and our players to go on a journey with Copycat. I love tragedy and I love sad films. I love Titanic. I wanted to see if we could do something similar in the game space, but also make it a little bit uplifting with a bit of that Pixar magic and whimsy. And I guess one thing that we learnt is that not every player wants to go on that journey, and that's okay. And I think that's the difference, because in traditional mediums, it's a little bit more passive. You're watching the protagonist go through these very difficult emotions, but in the video game, you play as that character. So every high you have, you get to share with the character, and every low you have, it really hurts. And so we had to try to find a balance between those. How do we make it emotionally impactful but still feel like the player is winning? That's something I've discovered over the last couple of months, and I feel like it's, the secret sauce to crack. How do you make the player feel like they're winning throughout the game but still take them on this emotional arc?
How do you do that?
Yeah, we're hoping to create characters that are authentic, create stories that are diverse, that resonate, and hopefully I'll get better as a game writer to try to craft these moments where people can enjoy and indulge in sadness and catharsis while still feeling fulfilled as a player.
There's a lot of talk in the TV world at the moment about how we build audiences using the community manager role that gaming has. What is this role in the game world, and how does it work in gaming?
The community manager is the creative tissue between the player and the developers. So they look after the players while the game is in development and look after the players while the game is out in the world. They are on websites such as Reddit or Discord or social media. And the reason why community managers are there is because games can be played repeatedly. Whereas more traditional mediums, you might watch a film or a TV show once and you might not revisit it. A big game that's really popular that uses it at the moment is Helldivers, and they're on PC and PlayStation. Example of what people have done in more traditional media could be Sonic the Hedgehog when that movie came out. So there was a big community behind it that loves Sonic as the character, but they didn't quite like how the film Sonic looked. And so they gave feedback really early on. They wanted his head bigger, his eyes bigger. They wanted to change some adjustments in the fur. And I know that was a really big undertaking for the TV studio to do so. But because of that, they were able to make those changes and then launch 3 fantastic Sonic films just by listening to the audience. You can't listen to everything they say, but, you pick and choose those battles.
So they were actually audience testing that image of Sonic early on those platforms, those interactive platforms, saying, hey, here's what it looks like. What do you think? Is that what happened?
I think the trailer went up and people saw on the trailer what Sonic looked like, so they shared their opinions there.
So the community manager really is about having that audience interface and making sure that the audience are listened to, they answer questions, they give feedback to the creators. That's how the role works in gaming. It's extraordinary. When you launched Copycat, you then changed the ending. Was that part of audience feedback?
Yes, we did. I wanted to do my best to tell a 3-act transformative narrative arc. I wanted the ending to be surprising but inevitable, and I'm always pushing for a happy ending. And so we had our character go back home in the end. But we had some players that wrote to us that were very vocal, and they said, hey, I've been on this journey with this cat, and I don't actually want to do what you're proposing in the end. I want to leave. And so interesting enough, we have this mechanic all throughout the game that was a stay or leave branching narrative. You could be at the back door and you could stay or leave the house, or you could be in the middle of the road and you could stay or leave if a car was coming towards you. So we had introduced that mechanic and we just decided, hey, why don't we just put that mechanic at the end, stay or leave, and the player can decide. We did that within a week. We weren't expecting to change it. Ultimately, players feel more satisfied because they don't feel like they're boxed into one choice. They have that agency and they can play the story in the way they want to.
Can you talk me through the mechanics of how you did that? What platform was it on at this point?
Computer, and we're working on our PlayStation at the moment.
Okay, so you could actually go into the back end, or did you have to pull it off and reload it to make that change?
No, we worked on an alternative version and then we were able to swap it over very quickly.
So anyone who already had the game would get it like it was a upgrade, like a 2.0?
Yeah, correct.
That's so interesting. Wow. I mean, because that changing an ending in television would be so complicated. What an interesting way of listening to your audience and responding to them in terms of increasing satisfaction. That's amazing. Gaming's just getting bigger and bigger. It really is such a growing entertainment industry. Why do you think it's growing so quickly?
From a writing perspective, what I think is really interesting is that decades ago, the people writing video games were programmers because, of course, they were the only people who could like put words into a script. So it made sense that they were the one writing. We've had a couple of decades. Game writers, the role of game writers now exists. We're getting more diverse stories, and then we can attract a more diverse player base because they are craving more diverse stories. We've seen the rise in visual novels. We've seen the rise in mobile games because they're fully accessible, especially in countries that people don't have a laptop or a PlayStation. They've got these mobile games and you can tell these beautiful stories on it. One great game is called Florence. It's by a Melbourne developer. That's a beautiful 45-minute game that's managed to live solely on mobile, which is wonderful. We also have the rise of AR and VR. So some good examples is Pokemon Go or Half-Life Alyx. It means we just have more tools and slightly different ways to tell stories all under the game umbrella medium.
What impact is AI having on the gaming world?
It's very divisive. I'm only talking on behalf of myself, but from my experience, it can either be really helpful or it could be really problematic. It's helpful because it's like you're talking to a friend or someone that can give opinions on what you're creating. But on the other side, people don't like it, of course, because there's a huge chance that it can take writers' jobs and take the jobs of a lot of people further down the pipeline. For us, we started using AI in a few of the components in the house. For example, we had some artwork that was around the room in the game, and we asked AI to work on that. And then very quickly, one of the companies that we were working with to upload the game said no AI is allowed at all. So we had to take those down and then find other methods. That was just one example. Another example was when we were doing our voiceover. We had a really wonderful 3 days. We were recording 10,000 words and we had about 6 actors come into a little studio in North Sydney. But we were actually accused of having AI voices in our game by one of the festivals that we entered. And so we had to actually show them our breakdown. We had to show them our behind the scenes video. We didn't do that. We know AI is very prevalent, but in this case we didn't. And we were able to negotiate. So I think it's a really tricky topic, but it's definitely a tool there for creators and game makers to use, hopefully down the track with a bit of ethical guidance.
Similar with, I believe, with Netflix, that they don't want you to deliver something that's got an artwork in it that is AI generated because they just can't guarantee the copyright, and it's really important. So imagine similar issues, but that's very interesting on an ethical basis that they were checking that none of your voice artists were AI generated. What are the gaming trends that you see that are exciting you right now?
I'm very excited about the boom in mobile. I think it's fantastic that we can work in a medium that can be taken anywhere and people can play at any time. The rise of visual novels is really special because it means that people who are quite beginner gamers that might not pick up a controller and might not be keen to do a mouse and some tapping on the keyboard, instead they can pick up these visual novels and it becomes interactive stories. From a writing perspective, the trend that we're seeing a lot is that there's not just one good or bad. There's a lot of morally grey area that writers are working in that we haven't seen before. And I think that's quite interesting.
In terms of the story, so that it's not just goodies and baddies, the story's getting more complex, you're saying. When you say a visual novel, you don't mean a graphic novel that's printed. You mean actually an interactive story that looks like a graphic novel, but you can go into the narrative and take it in a sort of choose your own adventure way. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I think visual novels are great, but they're quite linear. But visual novels in the video game world can have hundreds of thousands of words with so many different paths. They are almost the original branching narrative genre in combination with role-playing games. Visual novels are also interesting because you get to choose which path of the story to follow, but there are also some small interactive elements, like you might be asked to walk into a shop and decide what you want to buy, or you might be asked which character did you want to romance. And in Australia, we have a really great example of a visual novel that's been elevated. It's called Stray Gods. It is a role-playing musical that acts as a visual novel, and so they have voices that's been recorded, but it's not 3D. It's not a game that you go around and walk around a house. They're all 2D art, beautifully done and packaged into a book that you can play.
What platform does the visual novel sit on?
That one was on PC and Switch, Nintendo Switch.
Wow, it's so interesting. It strikes me also as a way that you could test a narrative for a game. Like you could build it as a visual novel, get some audience feedback, and then look at developing it into a game if you felt that you had a strong audience base there. Has it been used in that way, or do you think that would be a useful pathway?
Absolutely. It sounds like a very useful pathway. Some things games are doing is they're measuring how many people choose which pathway. And there are stats that you can see at the end of the game. For example, Life is Strange or another game called Detroit Become Human. They actually show at the end of each level what the percentages were based on what choices. And you can reflect on that and you can, again, replay the game to see the content that you missed.
And for you on Copycat, do you also get good back-end data in terms of how long people stayed, the choices that they made for the game?
We can see how long they played the game. In terms of choices, not so much, but that's just because it was our first project and we didn't have the back-end infrastructure to measure. But moving forward, definitely for our next game, it will be fascinating to see what people do. Because your little choices don't always have to be massive plot points. They can be little things like in Copycat, it was what piece of food do you want to pick up and bring to your owner? Did you want to pick up the apple or did you want to pick up the gooey eggshell and bring it back? And so you can kind of start to see some personality with some of these choices to see what archetypes your players have.
I never thought of myself as a gamer. I didn't grow up with gaming at all, but I was reading about definitions of gamers recently, and one thing I love to do is to play Wordle. And this article was saying you are a gamer, like the gaming spans the whole length. And so when we're talking about this rise in gaming, we're not just talking about, first person shooter. There's a really massive breadth of genres and lengths and narratives that you can go into, or things like Wordle, which are, low level interactive. Favorite part of my day.
Absolutely. It definitely counts for a gamer.
Obviously, this is a growing industry. For screenwriters or storytellers that want to move into or break into game writing, where's the best place to start? And any tips on getting into interactive storytelling?
Yes. So we're seeing a lot of transmedia happening at the moment. We have interactive TV series like Bandersnatch, Black Mirror, or the Bear Grylls one that came out a couple of years ago. But we've also got the opposite where we've got games being turned into series. So we've got HBO's Fallout, The Last of Us, or Arcane. There's a lot of IP floating around and a lot of opportunities for both writers and producers to kind of step into that field. We also have games like Harry Potter and The Walking Dead that made it into video games. And so having these producers with these interactive skills, the production line's similar. We still have people that go into motion capture suits and facial capture. We still have the voiceover process and we still have, the editing process and cutscenes. So there's a lot of similarities for producers and for writers of video games or television series that want to get into games. Yeah, just playing as many games as possible and getting the tone and the tone of voice for that project. It's interesting how much overlap there is in the two at the moment.
I produced a game that went alongside the Nowhere Boys. It was an interactive game. And to me, the process was a lot more like producing an animation in terms of the storyboarding and the building of it is quite structural early on, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's why we were able to jump into games because there was a lot of transferable skills. Of course, we had to learn a lot along the way, but I think it's just so exciting that we're at this point in video games that they are truly respected as an entertainment medium, but also unique in that way.
And I think this emotional complexity that you're talking about is part of what's taking gaming to the next level. And you're certainly leading that in terms of how you're creating that in the work that you're doing. So lovely to talk to you, Sam. I always like to finish off this podcast by asking people to pitch one big idea for the industry that they think would make it better for all of us. So I'd love to hear your big idea.
Yes. I think sadness and catharsis are a really important tool for video games, especially when they're narrative driven. Players seek out these, really rich emotional experiences, whether that's in novels or series. But I think, why can't we do that in video games? And so something that we experimented with was the trigger warning at the beginning of the game, especially if it's going to be highly emotional and it's going to last many, many, many hours. But I don't think that's enough. So the idea that I wanted to pitch today is a call to action system that gives players relevant resources, gives them a place to go to, a resource to read, something that's going to help them then transition out of the story. Because I feel like they go on this big, big journey and then it's over. And they might have these lingering thoughts still floating around. So, for example, if it was about a game dealing with loss, there could be resources on grief counselling. There could be links to Beyond Blue or something that can help tie this journey together. It doesn't need to be abrupt either. We could do something with the characters. Potentially the characters in the game could be the ones delivering these messages. But ultimately, I think that's a really wonderful way to normalise more conversations around mental health and make the gaming world a bit safer.
So interesting, because of this immersive world, if you go through a grief, you could come out, I mean, it can happen in a movie, but you could come out of a game really feeling like you've been through something. So what you're proposing is that there's almost a debrief built into gaming.
Wouldn't that be fantastic?
Yeah, so interesting. I remember, when I was an actor doing role playing, and after particular role plays that were quite intense, someone came up to me and got me to do mindfulness, get back into my body again in terms of letting go of that narrative. And I've even heard that performing the role of King Lear can have the impact on an actor's body of being in a minor car crash. When you're going this deep into something and an experience, it can be, as you say, really cathartic, but also maybe we need to look at how we let people gently come out of that and back into their life. I love that idea, Sam. So brilliant to talk to you, and look forward to all that you do next.
We Interrupt This Broadcast is hosted by Julie Eckersley and Kirsty Stark. This episode is brought to you by Expanding Media and Crew HQ.
We Interrupt This Broadcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we acknowledge them as the traditional custodians and first storytellers of these regions. Always was, always will be.